Rita and I had an opportunity to do a winter cruise of Fiordland. The first leg of our journey was a flight to Queenstown, where we took the opportunity to do some sightseeing. This is the steamship Earnslaw, which takes passengers out for cruises on Lake Wakatipu. The next day we took the bus to Tiana, the last stop before our cruise. The serenity of the lake was a good introduction to our Fiordland cruise. The next morning we assembled at the ferry terminal on Lake Manapuri to register and meet the cruise organisers, Real Journeys. We were soon on our way across Lake Manapuri on a high-speed ferry along with our fellow cruise passengers. As we neared the western arm of Lake Manapuri, we caught our first glimpse of the snow-clad mountains which are so much part of Fiordland. From the terminal at the head of the western arm of Lake Manapuri, we are ferried by helicopter to Preservation Inlet. Once we were over the high pass, we were treated to a stunning panorama of the extensive mountain scenery of Fiordland. It's hard to convey a sense of how remote, extensive and inaccessible these mountains are. Our vantage point also showed how extensive the fjord system is. Fiordland National Park has a total land area of over 12,000 square kilometres, almost none of which is accessible by road. Soon we are on our cruise ship for the week, the Milford Wanderer. Our first landing that afternoon was the site of an old gold mine, which featured an inclined chimney. And the first of many boilers that we were to see during our stay in Fiordland. Once on board again, we proceeded down Preservation Inlet towards our anchorage for the evening. The next morning we raised anchor after breakfast and were on our way again.
go ashore and go for a 3-kilometer walk up to the lighthouse there?
Once we were all on shore, we assembled for our briefing.
Yeah. Just stay in front of her, but if you find yourself heading out towards the lighthouse and you're not...
And then we were on our way, on the longest of our many walks over the week in Fiordland. This one took about 3 hours, but it was fairly easy level walking. Pusiga Point, known for its wild weather. Later on, we landed at Cromarty, the site of an old coal mining settlement on Preservation Inlet. Another of the many boilers we were to see that week. Further along the shoreline, we visited a hunting lodge. We then headed back to the boat and proceeded to our anchorage for the evening. The next morning, the weather had turned worse and it was threatening rain. So we made a short coastal passage out of Preservation Inlet and into Chalky Inlet. We saw our first albatross. Once we were inside Chalky Inlet, we made a landing and inspected the site of an old sawmill. The shape of the shrubs reinforced how strong the wind can be around here. Once on board, we had lunch and then proceeded to the north arm of Chalky Inlet to view the wreck of the Stella. We had a good close view of the wreck, as well as the surrounding bush. We then headed out of Chalky Inlet and along the coast to Dusky Sound. After a couple of hours' passage along the coast, we were cruising along the relatively sheltered waters of Dusky Sound. We reached Cascade Cove, our anchorage for the evening, just before sunset. The next morning, our first activity of the day was to motor through a narrow passage to explore one of the many sheltered bays that are present in Dusky Sound.
Yeah.
We then motored to another cove, Pickersgill Harbour, where Captain Cook and the Resolution spent some time in 1773 during their second voyage of the South Pacific. We made a shore landing and walked to Astronomer's Point, where Cook made observations to confirm his position.
The X-Max and that.
After lunch, we motored over to Anchor Island, where we made another shore landing.
Where the hell is it?
Yeah.
The island is covered in dense Rimu forest. Ideal habitat for the kakapo that have been put on there by the Department of Conservation.
Yeah.
We didn't see any kakapo, but we did come across a couple of South Island robins. In the afternoon, the wind built up to over 50 knots in the outer sound. So we motored up to the far reaches of Dusky Sound, where it was much more sheltered. On the way, we stopped to look at a colony of pied shags.
So this colony has been here for at least 200 years. It's quite amazing.
And we visited another almost totally enclosed bay, which was accessed by a narrow passage. We happened upon a pod of dolphins swimming up the sound. We also passed close by one of the many spectacular waterfalls cascading into the sound. Before reaching our anchorage for the evening. The next morning there was a sprinkling of fresh snow on the mountains. But the weather was improving and we got underway, headed for Pigeon Island. On the way, we stopped to inspect another colony of shags. We landed at Richard Henry's camp, where from 1894 to 1900 he worked to rescue the kakapo from extinction.
Life is kiwi. He did not keep kakapo in the pen. He found that they could climb out.
Back on board, we had lunch while we cruised back up the fjord. The drizzle that set in only added to the unique Fiordland atmosphere. Fiordland in the rain is a land steeped in mystery and otherworldliness. Finally, we reached our anchorage for the evening in Wet Jacket Arm, Dusky Sound. The next day the rain had stopped and we were on our way again. We passed yet another spectacular waterfall. We were headed down Breaksea Sound and out into the open ocean. The wind was blowing at 20 to 30 knots, so it was a rough passage. After about 2 hours motoring, we reached the entrance to Doubtful Sound. Inside the sound, the seas were calm enough to have some lunch. We stopped to look at some seals that were basking on the rocks.
It's just above the...
Yeah, I can't read it from here, so my eyes up.
And then we carried on down the Bradshaw Gyre Arm. The mountains are higher and the sides steeper in this part of Fiordland, making for spectacular scenery. We anchored and then kayaked up the Camelot River. Finally, we motored on to Precipice Cove and picked up a mooring for the night. The next morning we motored back to the main arm of Doubtful Sound. The aim was to take in some of the spectacular mountain scenery in this part of Fiordland. We motored down Crooked Arm, 15 kilometres long. This arm of Doubtful Sound features a spectacular waterfall. This fjord has some of the most dramatic scenery in the whole of Fiordland. Next we motored over to the Hall Arm to check out the scenery there. All too soon it was time to turn around and motor over to Deep Cove at the head of Doubtful Sound. The buses were waiting to take us over Wilmot Pass, back to the western arm of Lake Manapuri.